Chapter 1. The Curse That Wasn't Supposed to Have Exceptions. There is a pattern in the economic history of sub-Saharan Africa that is so consistent it has acquired the weight of natural law. A country discovers a resource. Foreign companies arrive with capital and contracts. The government signs. The extraction begins. The revenue floods in. Enough money to transform the country, to build schools and hospitals and roads, to lift a generation out of poverty. And then, with a regularity that should by now surprise no one, something goes wrong. The money flows to the capital flows to the elite flows the money out, to accounts in Zurich, to properties in London, to numbered companies in jurisdictions that ask no questions. The country remains poor. Sometimes it becomes poorer. The resource runs out, or the price collapses, and what is left is a ruined institutional landscape, a population that has learned to expect extraction rather than investment, and debt. Nigeria has earned over $1 trillion in oil revenues since independence. Its per capita income today is lower, in real terms, than it was in 1980. The Congo sits on the largest deposit of coltan on Earth, the mineral inside every smartphone, and remains one of the poorest countries in recorded history. This is not a story of African failure. It's a story of institutional design, or the absence of it. The resource curse is not geological, it is political. It is what happens when a government treats a finite natural endowment as a source of personal enrichment rather than a fiduciary obligation to its citizens, which makes what happened in Botswana so profoundly strange. In 1966, Botswana gained independence from Britain. It was, at that moment, one of the poorest countries on the planet. Landlocked, desert-dominated, with a cattle economy that barely sustained the people who depended on it, Botswana had 12 kilometers of paved road, 22 university graduates, and a GDP per capita of roughly $70 a year. 2 years later, they found diamonds. By every historical precedent, you know what happens next. Botswana did not follow the precedent. Chapter 2. The First President. To understand Botswana's economics, you must first understand Seretse Khama, because institutions are not built in the abstract. They are built by people who make specific decisions under specific pressures, and those decisions either hold or they don't. Khama was, by birth, the hereditary chief of the Bangwato people, the largest ethnic group in Bechuanaland, as Botswana was then known. He had studied law in Britain. He had married a white Englishwoman at a time when the apartheid government of South Africa considered such a marriage an existential threat to their racial ideology. He was, as a consequence, exiled by the British government, under pressure from Pretoria, from his own country for 6 years. A man who was exiled from his own country, under pressure from a neighboring racist regime, with the complicity of his colonial power, could have emerged from that experience with a very particular kind of grievance. Khama did not. He emerged from it with a very particular kind of clarity. He understood, in a way that few founding leaders do, that the most dangerous person in a newly independent nation is the leader himself, and that the institutions a government builds must be designed to constrain that person as much as anyone else. When Botswana gained independence in 1966 and Khama became its first president, he made a series of choices that were, by the standards of post-colonial African politics, nearly incomprehensible. He refused to nationalize the cattle economy, the basis of traditional wealth, for his own ethnic group's benefit. He built institutions before he built monuments. He refused to create a personality cult. He insisted that the civil service be competent rather than loyal. And when the diamonds were found, he did something that no resource-rich African government had previously done at scale. He negotiated. Chapter 3: The Negotiation That Changed Everything. In 1967, the Arapa diamond pipe was discovered in the Kalahari. De Beers, the South African mining conglomerate that controlled the global diamond market, moved quickly. They had a standard playbook for these situations: arrive with capital, offer royalties, take the majority of the value, and leave the government with enough to stay quiet. Khama's government did not follow the standard script. The negotiations that followed were among the most consequential business deals in African history, and they are studied today in the same way business schools study the construction of the Panama Canal or the founding of Standard Oil, not for the drama, but for the institutional architecture they created. Botswana insisted on a genuine partnership. The result was Botswana, a 50-50 joint venture between the government of Botswana and De Beers. Not a royalty arrangement, not a licensing fee, but an equal share of the enterprise itself. This meant Botswana did not merely receive a payment for diamonds extracted from its soil. It received half the profit from the entire operation, including the processing, the sorting, the valuation, and the marketing. The difference between a royalty and a partnership is the difference between a wage and ownership. Botswana chose ownership, and that choice compounded for 50 years. But the deal structure was only the beginning. What Botswana did with the revenue is what separates it from every comparable case in the development economics literature. A rule was established, informal at first, then institutionalized, that diamond revenues would not be used for current government expenditure. They would be used for investment in infrastructure, in education, in healthcare, and in a financial reserve that would protect the economy against price volatility. The government would live as far as possible within the means of its non-diamond revenue and treat the diamond windfall as a sovereign endowment rather than an operating budget. This is, in essence, the same logic that Norway applied to its oil fund, but Botswana implemented it earlier, with fewer institutional resources, under greater external pressure, and from a starting point of near absolute poverty. The intellectual achievement is, in some ways, more remarkable. Chapter 4: The Pula Fund and the Architecture of Restraint. In 1994, Botswana formally established the Pula Fund, a sovereign wealth vehicle managed by the Bank of Botswana and designed to hold the accumulated surplus of diamond revenues in excess of immediate developmental needs. The fund's mandate was explicit: to convert a finite resource into a permanent financial asset. Every generation of Botswana, the citizens of Botswana, would benefit from the diamonds, not just those alive during the extraction years. The government was acting as trustee, not as beneficiary. Alongside the Pula Fund, Botswana built something less visible, but equally important: a culture of fiscal conservatism in government. Budget deficits were treated as institutional failures rather than policy tools. Debt was avoided. The civil service, though not lavishly paid by international standards, was professional and functional. Corruption existed. Botswana is not a perfect country, but it was prosecuted rather than protected, and the Directorate on Corruption and Economic Crime had genuine operational independence. What Botswana built was not a government that was better than other African governments because its people were different. It built institutions that made it structurally harder to steal, and that is an entirely replicable achievement. The consequences, measured in human outcomes, are striking. Between 1966 and 2000, Botswana's GDP per capita grew faster than any other country in the world. Faster than South Korea, faster than China, faster than Singapore. The country moved from the bottom of the global income distribution to middle income status in a single generation. Life expectancy rose, literacy rose, infant mortality fell. Chapter 5. The Epidemic. In the mid-1990s, HIV/AIDS arrived in Botswana with a ferocity that was, even by the standards of the Southern African epidemic, exceptional. By 2001, Botswana had the highest HIV prevalence rate in the world. Nearly 39% of adults between the ages of 15 and 49 were infected. Life expectancy, which had climbed through 4 decades of development, collapsed, dropping from 65 years to below 50 in less than a decade. The workforce was being destroyed. Teachers, doctors, civil servants, the very people who had built the institutional architecture of the state, were dying. This was, by any measure, a catastrophe, and it was a direct test of everything Botswana had built. A government that had accumulated reserves rather than spending them on political patronage now had reserves to deploy. A state that had invested in healthcare infrastructure rather than presidential palaces had infrastructure that could be repurposed. A population that trusted its government, imperfectly but genuinely, was willing to engage with public health interventions that required honesty about the nature of the crisis. Botswana's response to AIDS became a model not because the government had more resources than its neighbors, but because it had the institutional competence and the political will to use what it had. In 2002, Botswana launched one of the first national antiretroviral treatment programs in sub-Saharan Africa, providing free ARV drugs to every citizen who needed them, funded in part by the diamond revenues that had been accumulating for 3 decades. The program was administered by a civil service that was functional. It was monitored by institutions that were independent enough to report failure honestly. The epidemic is not over. Botswana still has among the highest HIV prevalence rates in the world, though antiretroviral coverage has dramatically extended life expectancy back toward pre-epidemic levels. But the response demonstrated something important. The institutions built during the growth years were not ornamental. They performed under pressure. That is the ultimate test of any institutional design. Chapter 6. The Diversification Problem. In Gaborone today, the conversation among economists and policymakers is not about the past. It is about a problem that Botswana has known was coming for decades and has not yet solved. Diamonds are finite. The major pipes are expected to be significantly depleted by the 2030s. Botswana's economy remains, after 50 years of development, fundamentally dependent on a single commodity that it did not create and cannot replenish. The Pula Fund, though substantial, was not built on the scale of Norway's sovereign wealth fund, a country with a population 1/10 the size of Norway's and a diamond endowment that, while extraordinary, is not in the same category as North Sea oil revenues. The diversification challenge is real, and it has proven stubbornly resistant to policy. Botswana has tried to develop financial services, tourism, and beef exports as alternative economic pillars. None of them has come close to replicating the revenue or the employment density of the diamond sector. The country remains a middle-income nation in a region where middle income is genuinely impressive, but also one whose trajectory depends on solving a problem that no comparable country has yet solved elegantly. Botswana faces the same question that every successful resource economy eventually confronts. How do you build a second act when the first act was written for you by geology? There is also a political dimension that deserves honest treatment. The Botswana Democratic Party, Khama's party, and the party of every president since independence, has governed without interruption for nearly 60 years. In 2019, for the first time, the BDP came genuinely close to losing power. It won, but the margin was uncomfortable. A new generation of voters, born into relative prosperity rather than post-colonial scarcity, is asking whether a political system that has been, in practice, a managed single-party state can sustain itself, and whether it should.
The institutional question for Botswana today is not whether the government is corrupt. By African standards, by many global standards, it is not. The question is whether an institutional architecture built for a founding generation can adapt to one that has different expectations, not of prosperity, but of participation. Chapter 7. The Comparison That Matters. The Congo has diamonds too. It also has cobalt, coltan, gold, timber, and the Congo River, one of the most powerful hydroelectric resources on the planet. Its mineral wealth is so extraordinary that it has been described, without significant exaggeration, as a geological scandal. A country that rich, by the logic of economics, should not be poor. The Democratic Republic of Congo has a per capita income of approximately $600 a year. Botswana's is approximately $8,000. Both are African nations. Both found mineral wealth shortly after independence. The difference between them is not geography, not ethnicity, not culture, and not the generosity of the international community. The difference is institutional design. The difference is what a government chooses to do with the first contract, the first revenue, the first surplus. The difference is whether the people who govern treat public resources as a trust or as a prize. Botswana proves that the resource curse is not inevitable. It is a choice, made or not made in a specific room, by specific people, at a specific moment in history. And choices can be made differently. That is the lesson that development economists have been trying to extract from Botswana's experience for 30 years. It is a lesson that is difficult to operationalize. You cannot export Seretse Khama. You cannot replicate the specific circumstances of 1967. But it is also a lesson that is impossible to dismiss. Good governance is not a Western concept, an elite luxury, or a stage of development that poor countries cannot afford. It is the precondition for everything else. Botswana understood this at independence. Most of its neighbors did not. The difference in outcomes 50 years later is the most important economic data point in contemporary African history. In 1966, Botswana was one of the poorest countries in the world. It had 12 kilometers of paved road, a cattle economy, and no reason, by the evidence available, to expect anything other than the standard trajectory of post-colonial African poverty. Then they found diamonds, and instead of following every precedent that history had established, they did something almost unreasonably simple. They treated the diamonds as belonging to the future, not just the present. They negotiated a fair deal. They saved more than they spent. They built institutions that were harder to corrupt than to trust. The result is a country that nobody talks about enough, because success in the narrative economy of international media is less compelling than disaster. But if you are trying to understand why some countries escape poverty and others don't, Botswana is not an outlier. It is the answer. Thank you for watching Macro Atlas. The next biography is already being written. Subscribe, and we will bring it to you when it is ready to be told properly.